And the summer of 1925, a newspaper sold a dream, a small lot along a quiet Missouri River. They called it Times Beach. Families came, children swam, cottages rose by the water. For a while, it really was a small slice of heaven on earth. But paradise was built on a floodplain, and it was running out of money. To kill the dust on their dirt roads, the town hired one man with a truck full of oil. No one asked what was in it. No one asked what was in it. No one knew it carried one of the deadliest poisons ever made. For 10 years, they lived on top of it. Then the river came to wash it all away. This is the story of a town poisoned by accident, erased from the map and burned to ash. This is the long quiet. It began, like so many American dreams, with a newspaper and a promise. In 1925, the St. Louis Star-Times had a bold idea to sell more papers. For $67.50, the price of a 6-month subscription, they offered something no other paper dared to. Not a coupon, not a prize, a piece of land. A small lot, 20 by 100 feet, on the banks of the Merrimack River, just southwest of St. Louis. To a working family crammed into the smoky city, it sounded like heaven. A place to escape the summer heat, a place to call their own. And thousands of people believed it. They came by train and by automobile, rattling down dusty country roads to a stretch of former farmland along the water. They called it Times Beach, named for the very newspaper that had conjured it out of nothing. At first, it was everything they had hoped for. In summer, the riverbank came alive. Children splashed in the cool green water. Families spread blankets on the grass and fished from wooden docks as the sun sank low. Small wooden cottages rose one by one along the dirt lanes, painted bright, filled with laughter. But there was something the newspaper never mentioned in its glowing ads. Times Beach had been built on a floodplain. The Merrimack was calm and inviting in July. But it did not always stay that way. The oldest residents knew it. That is why the very first cottages stood raised on wooden stilts, on tiptoe above the ground, as if bracing for something. Still, in those early years, the dream held. Through the roaring 20s, the little town grew. A general store opened its doors. A church rose at the edge of the settlement. More families arrived each season, staking out their own small square of paradise, certain they had found a quiet corner of the world where nothing could ever go wrong. They could not have known that the ground beneath their feet, the very roads they would one day pave with poison, would become the most dangerous soil in America. They could not have known that this river, the reason they had come, would one day turn against them. For now the sun was warm, the water was clear, and Times Beach was still just a dream by the river. The nightmare was still 50 years away. But dreams, like summers, do not last forever. When the Great Depression swept across America, it did not spare the little town by the river. The families who had once come for weekend escapes could no longer afford a second home. The bright cottages began to empty. Paint peeled. Docks rotted. The laughter that had filled the riverbank grew quiet. Then came the war. Gasoline was rationed, tires were scarce, and the long drive out to the Merrimack became a luxury few could justify. The resort that Times Beach had been was slipping away, but the town did not die. It changed. Slowly, the summer cottages filled again, not with vacationers, but with working families who had nowhere else to go. People priced out of the city, looking for something cheap they could finally own. Times Beach became a year-round town of the poor and the hopeful, a place where a family could scrape by on very little. And they did scrape by. Money was always tight. The town had no real tax base, no help from anyone. When something broke, the residents made do. It was a hard life, but it was theirs. There was, however, one problem no amount of grit could solve: the roads. Times Beach had 23 miles of them, and not a single one was paved. In spring, they turned to mud. But summer was worse. Under the Missouri sun, the dirt roads baked hard and dry, and every passing car threw up choking clouds of dust. It drifted through open windows and settled on kitchen tables. It coated the laundry hung out to dry. It filled the lungs of the children playing in the street. The residents begged the town to do something. But paving 23 miles of road cost money, far more than Times Beach would ever have. So the town leaders searched for another answer. Something cheaper. Something that would settle the dust and cost almost nothing. They found it in a common practice of the time. All across rural America, towns were spraying used oil on their dirt roads to keep the dust down. It was simple, it was cheap, and there was a man nearby who would do it for next to nothing. His name was Russell Bliss, and when Times Beach called him, they believed they had solved their problem. In truth, they had just signed the town's death warrant. To understand what happened to Times Beach, you have to leave the river behind and travel 200 miles southwest to a chemical plant in the town of Verona, Missouri. In the 1960s, that plant produced a chemical used to make Agent Orange, the infamous defoliant used in Vietnam. Later, it manufactured hexachlorophene, an ingredient in ordinary soap and skin cleanser. On the surface, it was just another factory. But hidden inside its production was one of the most toxic substances ever created by human hands. Its name was dioxin. Dioxin is not a poison you can see or smell. It has no color, no odor, no taste. And yet, in amounts smaller than a grain of salt, it can cause cancer, birth defects, and death. It does not break down. It does not wash away. Once it enters the soil, it can linger for decades, silent and patient. At the Verona plant, dioxin was an unwanted byproduct, a thick, tar-like residue that collected at the bottom of the chemical tanks. And by the early 1970s, those tanks were full. The company needed someone to haul the waste away and make it disappear. That someone was a man named Russell Bliss. Bliss ran a small waste oil business. For a fee, he would collect used motor oil, industrial sludge, whatever no one else wanted. In this era, there were almost no laws governing hazardous waste. A man like Bliss could take nearly anything, and no one would ask a single question. So when the plant offered to pay him to remove its chemical residue, Bliss agreed. Over several months, he hauled away thousands of gallons of the dioxin-laced sludge and brought it back to his storage yard near Frontenac. There, he did something that would doom an entire town. He poured the toxic waste into his tanks and mixed it with his used motor oil. Now the poison was invisible, blended into ordinary-looking oil. And Bliss had discovered something remarkable about that oil. When he sprayed it on a dirt surface, the dust vanished, held down for months at a time. The people who saw it were amazed. It seemed like a miracle. No one knew what was in it. No one thought to ask. And soon, that miracle oil would be sprayed across 23 miles of road in a small, trusting town by the river. The first victims were not people. They were animals. In May of 1971, months before Times Beach ever called him, Russell Bliss was hired to spray the dirt floor of a horse arena at Shenandoah's stable near Moscow Mills, Missouri. The owner paid him to keep down the dust. Bliss sprayed the floor, and at first, everything seemed fine. Then the birds began to fall. Sparrows that roosted in the rafters dropped dead to the ground. Within days, cats and dogs around the stable sickened and died. And then the horses, strong, healthy animals, grew weak, lost their hair, and collapsed. Over the following months, dozens of horses would die. The owners were horrified. They could not understand what was killing everything that touched that arena. One of them, a woman named Judy Piott, refused to let it go. Her horses were dying, and she was certain the strange, oily spray was to blame. But when she confronted Bliss, he denied everything. It was just used motor oil, he said. Nothing more. Judy did not believe him. So, she began to investigate on her own. Night after night, she followed Bliss's trucks through the Missouri countryside, writing down every address where he sprayed his oil, a lonely witness to a crime no one yet understood. The same tragedy repeated itself elsewhere. At another stable near Jefferson City, 12 horses died. Worse still, the children who had played in these arenas developed painful sores across their skin, a condition doctors would later recognize as chloracne, a telltale sign of dioxin poisoning. The warning signs were everywhere. The animals were dying, the children were sick, and yet no one connected the dots. No one traced the poison back to its source. Then, in 1972, came the decision that would seal the town's fate. Times Beach, desperate to control its dust, hired Russell Bliss to oil all 23 miles of its roads. For just $2,400, over the next 4 years, Bliss sprayed as much as 160,000 gallons of his oil across the town. Children rode their bikes through it. Families breathed it in. It soaked into the ground beneath their homes. Times Beach was now the most contaminated place in America, and no one living there had the faintest idea. For 10 years, the poison lay hidden in the soil of Times Beach. It took 2 disasters, striking at almost the same moment, to finally bring it into the light. By 1982, the federal government had begun piecing together a terrible picture. Investigators from the Environmental Protection Agency had obtained documents, a list of sites where Russell Bliss had sprayed his oil years before. One name on that list stood out: a whole town, Times Beach. That autumn, the EPA sent workers to collect soil samples from the town's dirt roads. Quietly, they scraped up the dirt and sent it away for testing. The sampling was finished on December the 3rd, 1982. The very next day, the sky opened. Rain fell in sheets across eastern Missouri, and the Merrimack River, the same gentle river that had drawn families here half a century before, began to rise, and rise, and rise. It climbed over its banks. It swallowed the streets. It rose more than 14 feet above flood stage, the worst flood in the history of Times Beach. The muddy water surged through the town, pouring into homes, lifting cars, carrying away everything. Families fled with whatever they could grab. And as the flood spread across those 23 miles of oiled roads, it did something no one realized in the moment. It picked up the poison from the soil and carried it everywhere, into yards, into houses, into the very ground the water touched. The town was evacuated, and as the residents waited, cold and homeless, for the water to recede, the results of those soil tests came back. The numbers were staggering. The dioxin levels in Times Beach were hundreds of times higher than what was considered safe. It was by far the worst dioxin contamination the country had ever seen. Now the government faced an impossible question. How do you clean an entire town of a poison that does not break down, that has soaked into every road and every yard? How do you tell 2,000 people that the ground beneath their homes is deadly? On December the 23rd, 1982, 2 days before Christmas, the Centers for Disease Control gave its answer. It issued a chilling recommendation. The people of Times Beach should not come back. Their town could not be saved. In the aftermath, the wheels of government began to turn. In January of 1983, President Ronald Reagan created a special task force to deal with the crisis. And the following month, the decision was made. The government would do something it had never done before. It would buy an entire town and erase it. For $33 million, it purchased all 800 homes and 30 businesses of Times Beach. One by one, the families packed their lives into boxes and drove away for the last time. Some were relieved. Many were heartbroken. They were leaving behind not just houses, but memories, the riverbank, the summers, the only home some of them had ever known. By 1985, the state of Missouri formally erased Times Beach from existence, dissolving it by the governor's order. The streets fell silent, quarantine fences went up, and then the bulldozers came. House by house, the town was torn down until nothing was left but empty foundations and cracked, weed-choked roads. Then, in the 1990s, came the final act. A massive incinerator was built on the very ground where the town had stood, and it burned. Over 260,000 tons of poisoned soil were fed into the flames. What remained was buried in a great sealed mound. Times Beach was, quite literally, erased from the earth. Only one building was allowed to survive, an old roadhouse from 1935, standing alone where a town used to be. And then, something unexpected. In 1999, the land reopened not as a town, but as a state park, celebrating the famous Route 66 that had once run through Times Beach. Today, families walk the trails and picnic on green fields, most never knowing what lies beneath their feet. But the story does not end cleanly, because years later, a haunting question emerged. In 1991, the very government scientist who had recommended the evacuation admitted he had changed his mind. The danger, he now believed, may have been overstated. The town, perhaps, never needed to die at all. 2,000 people lost their homes. A community was wiped off the map. And the man whose oil started it all, Russell Bliss, was never convicted of a single crime. Times Beach is gone now, a green and quiet field where a town once dreamed by the river. This is the long quiet where history was left behind.